Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio-verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who keep supporting us here at Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, December 21st, 2024. We begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne. He's going to be joined on the line by Professor Joe William Trotter, Jr., Giant Eagle University Professor of History and Social Justice at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. For our purposes today, he's author of the book, Building the Black City: The Transformation of American Life. Then, in the second half of our show, we'll be hearing from Benjamin Barson, assistant professor of music at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania and author of the book Brassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies, and the Jazz Commons. He'll be joining Dr. Horne on the line to help us continue to understand a little bit more about one of our favorite pastimes of music in the diaspora. So be sure to stay tuned in. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and able to continue to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to please support our efforts here at KPFK. Community radio is more than radio. This station is a look at our community. We come together to be informed, entertained, and enlightened. What you get here on this station is greater than what you'll find on social media or your streaming services. And that's because this station is committed to community first. I am here to remind you that you rely on this station for news, music, and culture. You value community radio for enhancing your town as a place you love. Now, this is a good time for you to support this nonprofit station with a financial contribution. Donations from people like you make this station possible. So here's how to help. To make your pledge right now today, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Or go online to kpfk.org and make your contribution heard and seen today. Of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. Now, to make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Jay Dilla, Stanley Clark, Jonathan Powell, Gene Harris, Clifford Brown, and Thelonious Monk. Now, people, get ready for this train to come in, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Joe William Trotter, Jr.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line, it's Joe William Trotter, Jr., Giant Eagle University Professor of History and Social Justice at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and author of the book, Building the Black City, The Transformation of American Life. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Joe William Trotter, Jr.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, Building the Black City?
You know, there are several motivations behind the writing of this book, Gerald. Probably the first and most important one is that a couple of years ago, and I do believe you interviewed me on your show for another book that I had written in 2019. It was a book entitled Workers on Arrival and the Making Black Labor in the Making of America. That was 2019. And this book is a kind of sequel or follow-up to that book. Workers on Arrival was really the book about the way in which African American labor was exploited from the beginning of the nation during the colonial era through recent times. In many ways, the Workers on Arrival book was a historical case for reparations for African Americans, particularly reparations in the material terms, from lost labor, from the loss of land, and just simply the way in which over time African Americans had consistently faced a situation where they were deprived of the fruits of their energy, their expertise. And so this book was really a book about underscoring the inequality that African Americans face, and all of those issues that I know your show is interested in, the way in which incarceration, mass incarceration in recent years played into this whole process by which Black people were dispossessed. But this book here, the Building the Black City, is an attempt to come at the reparations story from a different angle. Because the reparations story is one of deprivation and extreme exploitation, it sometimes camouflages the way in which African Americans sort of employed their labor in their own interests. And so in a shorthand way, Building the Black City is a way in which African Americans built their own city at the same time that they were building the predominantly white city, a city that often they could not inhabit the buildings and the amenities that they helped to construct. And so as a result, they decided that they were going to double tax themselves and build a city within the city that would be designed to meet the needs of African Americans, economically, institutionally, and so on. And so that book is a book about creativity, energetic self-activity on the part of Black people. And it's a book about the way in which Black people were exploited, but they built something against the odds. Okay, but it's also a reparations book in the sense that I think it underscores and even deepens the case for reparation by adding the way in which African Americans use their own meager resources and double tax their labor in order to build institutions and amenities for themselves. And so that's the first sort of way in which Building the Black City is motivated or framed. But there are other things that motivated Building the Black City as well. And I want to underscore a couple of those, is that as Black people built the Black City, they were able to do this within certain kinds of contexts. And so what Building the Black City does is to take up several different themes in the way that African Americans also impacted the built environment of American cities through their labor building their own city. And so what the book does is take up about 4 major themes in the building of the Black city. And the first one is the way in which they were able to occupy space. And so there's a great emphasis on the way in which Black people moved into these spaces that were in many ways, discriminatory in efforts to keep them out, but they managed to gain a foothold on the land inside of cities. And I'm particularly focusing on cities in this book. And so they got a foothold in cities against the odds, and they were able to then use that foothold in the spatial structure of the city to construct their own institutions. And because this book starts with the colonial period, we see Black people sparsely spread out across the landscape, but at the same time, they were gradually building families and then communities. And they started to build institutions through their collaboration, through these networks of home ownership and also renting. I want to underscore, most of these early Africans and over time occupied space as renters, but they transformed that space in a way that comported with their own culture and their own ideals about what they needed to serve their communities. So that is one thing of spatial occupation of the land. And the second thing is building institutions on that land. And this is where the book goes into quite a bit of detail on building of churches, fraternal orders, all kinds of entrepreneurial enterprises, and just simply expanding the institutional infrastructure that was created to serve the needs of that community. And then the final thing on the other end, I talk about the ways in which African Americans, in a way, harness those institutional resources to political projects, so that they use the city as a lever to gain political influence and to advance a liberation movement in terms of African Americans gaining access to full citizenship rights, economic justice, justice before the law. They use cities to really advance those causes. So that's sort of in a nutshell of what this book is about. But it's also about saying that the case for reparations should also include attention to the creativity of African Americans against the odds, as well as the way that they were deprived of the fruits of their labor.
So you cover a wide range of cities, east, north, south, and west. How does Los Angeles, particularly, and California generally, fit into your story?
California was an interesting case because throughout this story, at least in the early part of it, through the mid-20th century, the great thing that stood out about California was this access to home ownership. They were able to manage somehow to get a larger share of housing than African Americans in other parts of the country. And another factor that they were distinguished by is the way in which they operated in an environment that was much more diverse than some of the other cities that I take up in the book, because Latinos, Asian Americans, and other groups figured into the politics of California in a way that it figured in some other cities as well, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But these were some of the distinguishing features, I believe, that characterized life out, in California and the West. And in that sense, also, we can see how the West managed to build a political structure within the context of this multi-racial environment. And that meant some collaboration, at times between African American and other non-white ethnic groups. So that's sort of the way I handle some of those issues emerging from the West. But by the mid-20th century, of course, the West had started to really build political movements that were characterized, by the rise of the Black Panther Party that really started to place the West on the map as a major site of liberation movements for African Americans. And so I do think Los Angeles has a unique place in the context of the Black city building process. But I have to say, they were also involved using their home ownership, using rental properties to build institutions. And I was very impressed by the number of newspapers that came out of California. When I deal with California, San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles. But in Los Angeles, there were some major hotels, Somerville Hotel, a major structure there, and major insurance companies that were able to affect the landscape by building imposing buildings, and the churches, the AME Church built an imposing building. And so California, I think, in the context of the book that I wrote, it figures prominently.
Mm-hmm. What about the role of gender in your pages, Professor Trotter?
Gender is critical. It is key to the institution building activities of African Americans. Not only the churches, but the fraternal orders, and almost all of these institutions, even businesses, they employed African American women in ways that help to fuel the development of these businesses. And gender figured in terms of the contribution of women, but it also figured in terms of the internal conflict that existed within Black institutions, so that there were systems of inequality, so that women had a difficult time gaining access to the front lines of leadership in Black institutions. And this is a theme that cut across all of the cities. But even against that obstacle, they still helped to fuel the way in which African Americans built their own cities and serviced their own people.
And what about deindustrialization? Because that's been a factor afflicting cities for a number of decades now. What role does that play?
Deindustrialization played a major role. In fact, one of the arguments that I make in this study is that by the time we get to the 1980s and the 90s and moving into the 21st century, the older Black city as we know it has started to fragment in ways that created the dynamic for a new era of city building. And that the loss of Black jobs in the industrial sector was a major factor in the way in which cities, these industrial era cities, began to fragment and in some ways break up, but they didn't disappear. And that's one of the arguments that I make, is that we too often overstate the degree to which these communities were undermined and displaced. They retain vitality. And I have to say, though, my story does not go deeply into this deindustrial era, the era from the late 20th century to the present. But I do try to sketch out that there is a new urban dynamic in which African American city building is beginning to become more complicated than before. There is a lot more suburbanization of the African American population and the rebuilding of institutions on the periphery of older, well-established Black communities. And I argue that we haven't given enough attention to the way that even in the midst of loss of industrial jobs and the way in which cities started to revamp its economy from a manufacturing base to a service base, we haven't really, as historians, documented that story in ways that give credence to the idea that the Black city building process did not stop when the older Black metropolis ran into this crisis in terms of loss of jobs, rising unemployment, incarceration, and all of that. We still have some dynamic people inside these cities trying to maintain and to rebuild on the inside of the old structure, but also building on the periphery of these older structures. And that's a story that I think we're going to have to give more attention to.
Finally, Joe William Trotter, Jr., Giant Eagle University Professor of History and Social Justice at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, author of the book Building the Black City, preceded by Workers on Arrival. Is there a third book coming out? Will this be a trilogy? If not, what is next on your research agenda?
That's a good question, Gerald. I tell you, there are some more books on the horizon. But the one that is really, there are a couple, but this one that I want to cite is a book that is a product of the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, I was actually working on building the Black city. And my publisher at the University of California Press and I had a conversation about the way people were raising questions about the meaning of this phenomenon and the impact of that phenomenon on Black people. And if you may recall, the early parts of that phenomenon, people were saying Black people might not be affected in the same way as others. And so what it did was to put me in a position of beginning to ask historically how Blacks have fared in the case of these kind of traumatic health crises, pandemics, epidemics, and so on. And I argue that one of the great dimensions of the African American health story is the way that they occupied jobs historically from the colonial period of enslavement to the present that put them in harm's way. And so the next book that I'm working hard to get out within the next couple of years will be that health book that tries to look at African American health issues from the vantage point of working people and the way that played out over a long period of time, including the deindustrialization period, because we've got, and by the way, these are syntheses that build on the work of so many other scholars. But now we have a number of interviews in Pittsburgh, for example, on the way in which Black people occupy the bottom rungs of the new health system and the new health system and the education system. But the medical system is especially a major employer of African Americans at the bottom rungs, and they are suffering while they're also building the new economy. And so part of the argument I'll make is that we have to really recalibrate the way we think about the loss of industry. Black people's labor continue to fuel the new economy, and we need to show how that happened in education and in medical establishment.
Well, we would look forward as well to that book with eager anticipation, Professor Trotter, author of the book Building the Black City. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, and for the world at www.kpfk.org. My name is Maggie Lepeak.
I'm Gary Baca.
And we're here to talk to you for a few minutes about a project we have going. It is the Transmitter Repair Fund in our December fund drive. Now, due to years of deferred maintenance at our transmitter site, we have been operating at only half the power. But now we have an exciting opportunity to amplify our impact, literally. We are ready to increase the power of our station, allowing us to reach more listeners, improve broadcast quality, and connect with communities that need our message. However, we can't do it without you. Please support the Transmitter Repair Fund in our December fund drive by calling 818-985-5735, option 2. Gary, what's that number again?
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, option 2.
Or pledge online anytime at kpfk.org. Any additional funds raised for this project will support our daily operations, including resuming regular maintenance at our transmitter site. Now here's something special, Gary, so get ready. Drum roll, please. John Densmore, legendary drummer and founding member of The Doors, and a wonderful friend to this radio station, has donated $5,000. That's 5 G's.
Whoa.
To our Transmitter Repair Fund. And you know what, Gary? John said, let's match this and help the station get back its power.
Yes. And the transmitter is something that we need. We need to broadcast at full power. We need to be heard and not silenced. So it's up to you to go to your phone now and support this separate fund that we have to maintain our transmitter. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Go to your phone now, even if you pledged before and pledged for the station. This is very important. This is something that we're trying to do, and individually reach out to you and say, hey, you know what? We need to operate at full power. So we need a strong signal. So it's up to you to come up front and step up and help us out. That way we can keep KPFK with this signal going all over Southern California. 112,000 watts of listener-sponsored radio. So big shout out to John Densmore from The Doors,
John,
for helping us out. And it's many people
John,
like you that help us out during this time of need. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Let the phone room know that you want to help us with our transmitter so we could be restored to full power, and that way we can broadcast throughout all of Southern California.
That's right, Gary. Southern California and beyond. It's people-powered, and you have the power. Call us right now, 818-985-5735. Hit option 2. That's 818-985-KPFK, and online anytime at kpfk.org. Now, Gary, for 65 years, KPFK has been a vital part of our community, with the goal of bringing together the voices, music, and stories that define Southern California. With this 110,000-watt transmitter atop Mount Wilson, KPFK is one of the most powerful FM stations in the western United States. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, due to years of deferred maintenance at our transmitter site, we've been operating at only half the power. But this is such an exciting opportunity for folks to help us increase the power of our radio station. And again, to reach more listeners, to improve broadcast quality, and connect with those communities that really need us the most. Once again, it comes down to you. We cannot do this work without you. Increasing the station's power requires new power supplies for the transmitter, replacing the ice shields for the antenna, upgrading the cooling system for the control building, and adding a new dry line dehydrator unit. The total cost of this project is $20,000, and we're asking for your help to make this a reality. With John Densmore's $5,000 pledge, we're on our way to reaching our goal, but we can actually double that goal if we can match the $5,000.
Yes, let's match that. So $5,000 on the table. So that would mean maybe 5 of you pledging $1,000 to help us get our transmitter to full power. Or maybe that's 10 of you pledging $500. Whatever you can do makes a difference. $250 per person will get us to that $10,000 match. 818-985-5735. So what's happening is when you drive out of town, there's a signal that's coming from Tijuana, and it's bleeding right into our KPFK signal. And so for some folks, they're like, hey, the signal's not that strong. Kind of annoying because you want to listen to KPFK throughout your drive and your commute. So this would help us out, and this would bring back our signal to full power, and that's because of you. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Once we do this, we're good. This is one of the last things on our list that we need to fix. And as we change as a radio station, we're going to make sure that we give you the programming that you need and love, and you'll want to hear it with this full signal. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK.
818-985-5735. Press option 2 to donate. Your gift of any size brings us closer to realizing this dream. Because, Gary, it really is a dream to be back up to full power, because we've been at almost 50%, sometimes even less, over the last few years. So there's so many areas of Southern California that have been missing us. You can make this dream a reality. Together, we can ensure that KPFK continues to inspire, inform, and uplift more people than ever before. Join us in powering up for the future. Power to the people. To contribute, visit www.kpfk.org/support-KPFK. You'll see the transmitter icon on the website. Just click that. It'll take you right where you need to go. Also, if you wanted to contact me, feel free to email me at mlepique@kpfk.org. That's MLEPIQUE@kpfk.org. Every dollar counts, and your support truly matters.
Just one of many bills that we have, but John Densmore from The Doors. Can you imagine The Doors? I mean, this iconic group that gave us Light My Fire and Hello, I Love You is challenging us and asking you. John Densmore is literally asking you to pledge your support. He put down the $5,000. I just can't believe it. John Densmore, out of all people, the drummer from The Doors, is challenging us and saying, you know what, I'm going to help you guys out. But if I'm going to put this money in, I want other people to pledge and put their money in as well.
That's right.
So that's why it's so important, and it's an honor to have John Densmore contributing to this radio station, listening and supporting us as he has through the many years, along with Robbie Krieger from The Doors. So, he's challenging us to step up. So pledge at any amount you can. Any amount helps. And you'll be right in there with John Densmore and the KPFK family, and we'll be restored back to the full power that we have to offer, that we should be offering. So we're only at 50%, and we'd like to be at 100. So that means you call now, 818-985-5735.
And one of the most famous, iconic, there's so many of them, Gary, from The Doors. Thank you so much, John Densmore. But you know what we need to do, Gary? We need to break on through to the other side.
Let's do it.
Show your support. Call us right now. It's people-powered. You have the power. 818-985-5735. Hit option 2. That's 818-985-KPFK. And online anytime at kpfk.org. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you to our listeners and the people pledging and calling in now. 818-985-5735. Don't forget, people-powered independent radio. Call the number now so we can be restored back to full power.
You got the power. Thank you so much, and let's make this happen together. Happy holidays, everyone.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Benjamin Barson, Assistant Professor of Music at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and author of the book Brassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies and the Jazz Commons. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Benjamin Barson.
It's an honor to be here. Can I call you Gerald, or Professor Horne is what my instincts tell me to address you. But I've been reading your work for decades, and it's so surreal to be able to speak to you now, almost in the flesh. But we're connected by this technology and by spirit and by struggle. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, Brassroots Democracy?
Thank you for the question. I worked a lot with a revolutionary baritone saxophonist named Fred Ho. Fred Ho was, in many ways, a student of the tail end of the Black arts movement. He told me many a time about driving with and driving Amiri Baraka to various meetings. They were in the League of Revolutionary Struggle together, which was a Marxist, Maoist with different tendencies formation that emerged out of the sort of post-Panther revolutionary era. And Fred was a brilliant composer, musician, writer, organizer. He really wore so many hats and wore them all with a high degree of virtuosity. And he wrote in many places, such as his Reader, Wicked Theory, Naked Practice, that jazz, or he always put jazz in quotation marks because he felt like it was a racist and a colonial term, but he said African-American music is the revolutionary music of the 20th century because it expresses the contradiction of the century between an African-American proletariat and the rise of finance capital. And I always thought this was a correct thesis, but one thing that I wanted a little bit more from was more historic substantiation of how and why that came to be. And now when I started writing this book, Jazz and Justice had not yet been released. It was a great resource to have that volume of yours. But there's still, and there's been obviously blues people by Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka. There's just been so much rich literature theorizing this. But in terms of having a archivally based historiographic methodology to think through that connection and how it was contingent and created, it wasn't just a priori thing that people inherited, that it was constructed over several generations. I felt like that was a contribution that I could make. And I was actually doing a PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in the Jazz Studies department, but I got lured over to the history department where I was working with folks like Marcus Rediker. And Marcus was a tremendous influence. He had this kind of volunteer association of grad students and professors that would meet every Wednesday called the Atlantic Gang. And our task was to think through Atlantic history, broadly speaking. Atlantic meaning, thinking transnationally, transcolonially, from below. That was, red and black Atlantic combined. And that was such a productive space for me to, kind of find the gaps in the musicological literature, which does such a good job about thinking about aesthetics and affect and cultural agency, but is not always connected to the social movements and the political economy of those eras. Another big influence, I should say, is Clyde Woods' Development Arrested. And of course, there's so many I'm not recalling right now off the top of my head. But that's how I began writing this book. I felt like the periodization of jazz's radicalism and the sort of free jazz avant-garde movement of the Black arts movement is correct, and yet is also not the full story. I wanted to show that there were different roots and routes to this music taking on revolutionary connotations and being connected to actual social movements and political struggle as early as the Reconstruction era. So that's how Brassroots Democracy came into being.
So what is the role of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution in your story?
One of the things that really stood out to me about the historians community that I became more and more involved in is how significant the Haitian turn has been. It's now impossible to talk about the age of revolution without mentioning Haiti, without censoring Haiti. Of course, this was not always the case, Haiti was and continues to be silenced in many spaces. Most of all, our mainstream political discourse continues to demonize and vilify Haitians. In reality, the Haitian Revolution was the most revolutionary revolution in an age of them, and it was the revolution that put anti-slavery and anti-racism on the map. It was not possible to have a revolution in the Americas after the Haitian Revolution that was not abolitionist. People sure tried. White Creole elites tried to keep slavery on the table in their post-independence constitutions, but if they wanted support from the independent Haitian state, it was contingent on these leaders abolishing slavery. This was Simon Bolivar's, one of the grand incentives for him to really be unconditional in abolition. Of course, there's a lot of literature on that, and I don't want to paint Bolivar as an uncomplicated figure, but of course, he was a great emancipator, and that can't be denied. Just to go back to the subject of Louisiana often gets left out of this conversation about the influence of Haiti. It's usually viewed from the point of view of reactionary planters. That's Alfred Hunt's argument in The Slumbering Volcano, that the main influence of the Haitian Revolution was to promote reaction and fear amongst white slaveholders in the South, and it surely did. But what I found not discussed as much in accounts of early jazz is the fact that so many of the musicians that were fundamental to the jazz revolution, ones we know like Jelly Roll Morton and Sidney Bechet, and also ones that are less known like Daniel and Mamie Deydun, were descended from Haitian or Saint-Domingue refugees that or migrants that either fled the Haitian Revolution or fled Napoleon's genocidal counter-revolutionary campaign that ultimately failed. And the fact is, these immigrants doubled the population of New Orleans between 1794 and 1810 and tripled its population of free people of color. And so what I tried to trace was not only the vectors of a plantation economy that had been essentially imported into Louisiana by these slave owners who perfected the art of sugar harvesting and extraction and overwork of enslaved people, and I put art in quotation marks. Obviously, these were concentration camps on a massive scale that were being reproduced every generation. But also the counter-revolutionary culture, the counter-plantation revolutionary culture of the Haitian Revolution was also exported and from Haiti into Louisiana. And one of the ways this was primarily done, I argue, was just precisely through music and expressive culture. In the early 1790s, 1792, 1793, the Baron de Cardinale, who was the Spanish colonial governor of Louisiana, was freaking out that French, what he called French Jacobin songs, were being sung by free people of color and people of color in Louisiana, New Orleans. He saw it as a prophecy of a incoming slave revolt. So much so that his son actually got into a fight with musicians in a salon for playing what he called the French contradance. The French contradance instead of the English one. And of course, when we're talking in this time period, adjectives like French and Spanish usually referred to Saint-Domingue or Cuban or Mexican rather than their colonial ruler. So we have these creolized rhythms and songs coming through that were extremely radical, that had been in proximity to revolution, had been in proximity to overthrowing not only slavery, but eventually defeating Napoleon's armies. And a really Maroon vanguard was at the head of these revolutions. These were the folks who initiated the uprisings with Boukman in Haiti. And you have the same types of Maroon ecologies in Louisiana. You have Brass Coupé, who's a famous Maroon who is hunted by the Louisiana police, and his arm is shot off. He is claimed by Sidney Bechet as his symbolic grandfather, as the site of the birth of jazz. And in my research, I found a lot of musical exchanges happening in these maroon spaces. And these might be in the swamps outside of New Orleans, but these might also be in taverns run by free Black people in the city, which were frequented by both Black sailors coming from points north and from Jamaica and the Antilles, but also from runaways that were coming from Louisiana and also points south. And so it just became striking to see this kind of underground, subterranean system of communication that was mediated in many ways by and through music. And here I connected to the work of Julius Scott, whose brilliant work, The Common Wind, sort of set the historical and theoretical foundation for that argument. So Haiti is hugely important in the antebellum period. There's even migration of free people of color back to Haiti in the 1850s. And this is, this is so frequent that there are songs that come to Louisiana, that are transported to Louisiana, that reference events in Haiti, not from the Revolution, but from the 1850s and 1860s. So fast forward to Reconstruction, and many of these folks who are descended from Saint-Domingue Haitian refugees invoked the Haitian Revolution and invoked their identity as Haitian to ground their radical claims, which were not so radical. That plantations where peoples of African descent had been enslaved ought to be broken up and repatriated as a form of reparations to those people who had worked the land for generations. Of course, this radical land reform program was blocked, and if it hadn't been blocked, and it was blocked by a coalition of northern capitalists and unreformed ex-Confederate planters, if it hadn't been blocked, we might be living in a very different historical moment today. But of course, it is, and the South becomes a site of reaction for basically up until now. Anyway, that's how I see Haiti connected, and the rhythms that these migrants brought with them, the Siquillo, the Habanera, the Tresillo, continued to be foundational to early jazz musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, like Sidney Bechet, so much so that those rhythms are still in frequent circulation today.
So you have also spent time in Mexico. Talk to us about that experience, what you were doing there, and how it might have shaped the argument in your book.
Yes, the experience in Mexico that I've had actually goes back to before I began this book, and it was a class I took as an undergraduate at a Hampshire college with someone who knows you from your Radical America days, Margaret Cerullo. Mm-hmm. She passes her greetings to you. We took a class, I took her class on the Zapatistas, and it culminated in us visiting one of the Caracals, their autonomous collectivist communities that are run independently of the Mexican state. We visited Oventique, and I was 18 at the time, and I didn't really have a radical, I was open, but I didn't really have the tools to make sense of racial capitalism or capitalism at all. Getting that perspective on neoliberalism, which I hadn't even heard of before, and understanding the legacies of NAFTA, and seeing this incredible cosmopolitan, syncretic, revolutionary ideology that was a sort of blend of neo-Marxist and indigenous Mayan revolutionary traditions. It really transformed my life, and it set me on the path that I ended up taking as a jazz musician and cultural organizer in a variety of radical spaces before I became a professor. I try to continue doing that work today. So Mexico has always figured very strongly and present and prominently in my imagination and a possibility. It wasn't until I met my partner, Giselle Zanoth Rodriguez, that I visited the Zapatistas again with her. She is Mexican, indigenous Yaqui descended singer and guitarist and cellist. And we started working together in a variety of musical projects, most consistently a group called the Afro-Yaqui Music Collective, which was in part an homage to Fred Ho's Afro-Asian Music Ensemble. And I ended up moving to Mexicali, Mexico, where she is from, partly because of the pandemic and a tragedy that befell her family. Her brother, unfortunately, was working in a meatpacking plant in Eastern Washington, one of the first locations affected heavily by COVID. And I don't know if you remember, but there was huge scandal that emerged because apparently the managers of these meatpacking plants were almost deliberately not following protocol and on COVID protocol and taking bets on when their employees would get sick. Well, of course, her brother did get sick and he passed away very early on, and her parents got sick. So we moved to Mexicali during the pandemic. I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was Zooming in my instruction anyhow, and we helped her family get resituated. And I found a really amazing radical community of principled organizers and scholars in Mexicali that I continue to stay in touch with. Folks like Yvonne Martinez, Nathy Carrillo, Mauricio Villa, and Areli Veloz. These are folks who are in my generation or a little bit older, and they're theorizing the border, capitalism, transnational resistance, the legacies of the Mexican Revolution, in really interesting and productive ways. And it just struck me how much North American scholars like myself had not been paying attention and continue to really neglect these voices, these organic intellectuals of these neoliberal spaces produced at the border. So I applied for a Fulbright and I got it. And I started doing a Fulbright postdoctoral scholarship at the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California. I took classes on cultural theory and cultural studies and border, and reread Gramsci in Spanish and all kinds of stuff, Dussel. And I also was able to share some of my work and do deeper work on the influence of jazz in Tijuana and Baja California during the 1920s. This was an interesting space where folks like Jack Johnson, who you write about in your own work, how Jack Johnson set up a space in Tijuana, jazz clubs in Tijuana, and I was trying to do some more archival research on what was the reception of jazz at that time amongst trade unions, amongst the youth. Very contradictory, actually. Turns out that there were folks in their 40s and 50s and 60s who were very threatened by these sounds, but there was a younger generation of Mexicans that were very excited about Black musicians and coming in and developing this hybrid culture there. And so I was sort of trying to trace those connections and also the examples of Mexican and African-American solidarity that emerged through sound. What I ended up finding was that the roots of this exchange go way deeper than I had imagined, dating back to at least 1850s Veracruz, when it was a haven for African-American runaway enslaved people that made a home there. Of course, they escaped in great numbers, in the thousands, 4,000 to 5,000 by some estimates, all across the borderlands. But Veracruz, being a very prominent location of Afro-Mexican culture, was one place in the Gulf that these folks gravitated towards. And turns out there was also a community of free people of color in Louisiana who were invited by the government of Benito Juarez to create a commune in Veracruz that was a sort of sanctuary during the ascendance of an even more reactionary right-wing planter class government by the late 1850s. This 100 families migrate there, and amongst these families are a clarinet dynasty, two clarinetists who go on to revolutionize New Orleans Black music, and named Lorenzo and Luis Tio are actually born in Veracruz. And it's a fascinating story. I just had never heard of this, and I would not have been turned onto it and open to it, I think, if I hadn't been in Mexico at the time. So then the challenge became how to write this border history into this history of New Orleans that's already thinking transnational nationally, transcolonially, with the influence of the Haitian Revolution. So that became the third chapter of the book, which I called La Frontera Sónica, Mexican Revolutions in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands. And I go back to Mexicali frequently. Last year, I worked with Salim Washington, a saxophone player and scholar who's currently a professor of global jazz studies at UCLA. We did a binational jazz concert along with a trumpet player, a Chicano trumpet player named Jonah Francese, and a really great rhythm section of Mexicali musicians, including Humberto Emmanuel Catalan. So that was that's how I kind of continue to connect to Mexico in my work.
Well, Benjamin Barson, assistant professor of music at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania and author of the book Brassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies, and the Jazz Commons. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Gerald. It's been an honor to be here, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Ditto.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Joe William Trotter Jr. from Carnegie Mellon University and author of the book Building the Black City, The Transformation of American Life. We then want to thank Professor Benjamin Barson from Bucknell University and author of the book Brassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies, and the Jazz Commons. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding his train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. This station is an essential resource in your life, whether it's reliable information you can use or joyful music that inspires your community. This station provides programming that you rely on. You are an essential part of this station as well. Listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and arts alive. Listeners' money fuels this station's power to operate. And if you're going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers also count on you. Your contribution to this hour enables the essential resource to provide vibrant radio. And here's how you can help. To make a pledge, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. You can also go online to kpfk.org. This right here has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.